Deep inside the fortified walls of the Egyptian capital, the second most powerful ruler on earth issues a command that should have guaranteed his assassination. He stands before 11 desperate, starving men from Canaan, men who have already proven they are capable of slaughtering an entire city when crossed. Yet, this royal official orders his armed protectors, his servants, and his entire court to immediately leave the chamber. He locks himself in alone with men known for blood. Picture it. The heavy bronze doors pull shut, echoing through the empty marble hall. The silence that falls over that vast stone room is thick enough to choke on. The brothers from Canaan do not know what is about to happen. They only know that the man holding the power of life and death over them is shaking with a pressure he can no longer contain. The weeping is already rising in his throat, but the absolute paralyzing terror that is about to drop on these men will not come from an executioner's blade. It will come from a removed mask, a shattered language barrier, and a devastating indictment buried inside a single question. The King James Version captures the breaking point of this 22-year charade in Genesis chapter 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him, and he cried, "Cause every man to go out from me." And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. Stop right there. Read that command again, not as a polished Sunday school story, but as a tactical nightmare. Joseph, the lord of the land, is deliberately isolating himself with his would-be murderers. He is stripping away every layer of his physical defense. The armed guards, the courtiers, the protocol that keeps peasants away from the throne. But there is another record, an ancient Jewish historical text called the Book of Jasher, that details exactly how volatile this room was just seconds before the guards were sent away. Jasher paints a picture of a standoff so violent, so deeply explosive, that the Egyptian throne room was physically shaking with the threat of war. See the scene. According to this ancient text, Judah was roaring like a lion, his voice so terrifying that Pharaoh's own soldiers were paralyzed with fear. The brothers, pushed to their breaking point over the arrest of Benjamin, were threatening to tear the city of Memphis apart. They are cornered animals, heavily armed in their spirits, capable of unthinkable violence. And into this exact moment of lethal, boiling tension, Joseph dismisses his royal guard. He leaves himself entirely vulnerable to the very men who once threw him into a pit to die. Same brothers, same victim. He has played the cold foreign tyrant for months. He has spoken through the official interpreter, keeping a thick wall of Aramaic and Egyptian between them. He has pressed them to the absolute limit, to see if they are the same men who sold him for 20 pieces of silver. He knows their capacity for cruelty. But the test is over, and the dam is breaking. The grand hall is stripped down to nothing but 12 men and decades of unresolved blood guilt. The armed men of Egypt are gone, leaving an unbridgeable silence between the throne and the accused. The tension in the room is drawn as tight as a bowstring, but before a single word of revelation is spoken, the physical barrier between them has to fall. What was the one piece of the Egyptian facade that Joseph had to tear down before his brothers could finally see his face? The marble floor of the Egyptian palace is vibrating, not from the march of guards, but from the raw, guttural fury of one man. Judah has drawn a line in the stone, and he is ready to drown the capital in blood to keep it. Genesis chapter 44, verse 18, sets the fuse just moments before the room is cleared. It reads, "Then Judah came near unto him, and said, O my Lord, let thy servant, I pray thee, speak a word in my Lord's ears, and let not thine anger burn against thy servant, for thou art even as Pharaoh." Stop right there. The King James gives us the diplomatic translation of a desperate plea. But the ancient Jewish tradition, recorded in the book of Jasher, pulls back the curtain on a physical escalation that borders on the terrifying. In Jasher's account, Judah's desperate diplomacy violently shifts into martial rage. He threatens to unsheath his sword and make the ruler of Egypt his first casualty. He screams with a voice so devastating that the text claims it shook the foundations of the city, causing Pharaoh to tremble in his own distant quarters. Jasher records Judah threatening to color the river of Egypt with blood, just as he and Simeon had once painted the walls of Shechem. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. But it captures the rabbinic understanding of just how close this room was to absolute slaughter. See the scene. These are not timid shepherds begging for scraps. They are hardened men of the desert, pushed into a corner, completely unwilling to abandon Rachel's youngest son to an Egyptian dungeon. Judah is breaching the royal distance. He steps inside the perimeter. He is breathing down the neck of the man he thinks is a pagan tyrant. Two lions circling each other. One of them is ready to kill. The other is struggling to breathe. Because underneath the heavy linen robes and the gold chains of state, Joseph is watching a miracle unfold. The very brother who coldly orchestrated his sale into slavery 22 years earlier is now offering up his own life, his own freedom, to save Benjamin. The test is complete. The brothers are not the same men who sat down to eat a meal while Joseph screamed from the bottom of a dry well. The rot in the family line has stopped. Reading, not inventing, the armed guards have been banished. Judah's chest is heaving. The threat of war hangs in the dead air of the empty chamber. Joseph is standing face to face with the men who shattered his life, holding the absolute power to erase them from the earth. But instead of calling his executioners back into the room, Joseph prepares to drop the charade. To do that, he must dismantle the final weapon he has used against them since the day they arrived in Egypt, the weapon of language. The physical distance between the men has closed, but a massive psychological wall still stands in the dead silence of the throne room. A crucial piece of the Egyptian facade must vanish before the truth can be spoken. Where is the one man who has stood between them through every previous interrogation, and what happens the moment he is quietly removed? The throne room is finally empty of Egyptian guards, but another figure is entirely missing from the shadows. Since the day these 11 Canaanites first dragged their starving bodies into the palace, a third party has always stood between them and the throne. Genesis 42-23 reveals the mechanics of the deception. And they knew not that Joseph understood them, for he spake unto them by an interpreter. Stop right there. The interpreter was the wall. He was the linguistic armor that kept the Egyptian ruler detached, foreign, and terrifying. The brothers had already confessed their darkest, most deeply buried sin right in front of this throne. In Genesis 42, they stood before this very ruler and said to one another, "We are verily guilty concerning our brother. Therefore is this distress come upon us." They spoke those words in their native Hebrew. They believed their bloody secrets were perfectly safe inside the syllables of their homeland. They were wrong. The ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Torah, Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, preserves a chilling rabbinic tradition about this middleman. It records that this royal interpreter was not a hired Egyptian servant at all, but Manasseh, Joseph's own firstborn son. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but it sharpens the razor edge of the history. Joseph had been using his own flesh and blood to filter the desperate, unknowing confessions of his betrayers. Now, the interpreter is dismissed. The heavy bronze doors are shut. The shield is dropped. Picture it. The brothers stand bracing for the translation of the ruler's final verdict. They expect to hear the harsh command of an Egyptian executioner demanding Benjamin's life. Instead, the dead air of the chamber is shattered by a sound that defies all royal protocol. Genesis 45-2 records the physical breaking point. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard. Read that again. This is not a silent, dignified tear falling on marble. This is a violent, chest-heaving wail, a guttural roar of 22 years of grief, trauma, and vindication tearing out of a man's throat. It is so explosive that the text says, "The house of Pharaoh heard it." The armed guards outside the thick stone doors, the servants in the corridors, the nobles standing in the distant courtyards, they all hear the undisputed lord of the empire breaking down. The brothers are completely paralyzed. To them, the most powerful, unpredictable tyrant in the known world has just locked them in a room and collapsed into uncontrollable sobbing. Same silence, same terror. The psychological pressure in the room is absolute. They are trapped. But the weeping is only the prelude. The Egyptian facade has cracked, but the disguise is not fully destroyed until the language of the room shifts. Joseph is about to draw a ragged breath, look directly into the eyes of the men who threw him into a pit, and bypass the missing interpreter. The sobbing stops. A new voice fills the room. But when the first unmediated Hebrew words finally strike the air, what exactly does he say? And why does the sound of his true name land on these men like a death sentence? The heavy sobbing echoes into silence, leaving only the ragged breathing of 12 men in a locked marble chamber. The Egyptian ruler lifts his head. The heavy kohl makeup of the royal court is likely streaked with tears, the polished facade of the empire washing away before their eyes. He does not signal for the guards. He does not wait for an interpreter. He opens his mouth, and the language of Pharaoh is gone. Genesis chapter 45, verse 3, drops the hammer. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? Stop right there. Look at the first half of that revelation. In the original Hebrew, it is only 2 words, Ani Yosef. I am Joseph. For 22 years, the brothers believed that name belonged to a ghost. It belonged to a teenager pleading for his life from the bottom of a dry well in Dothan. It belonged to a bleeding slave dragged away by Midianite traders for 20 pieces of silver. It was a name buried under decades of carefully maintained lies, a name they could not even speak aloud in Canaan without tasting their own guilt. Now, that buried name is spoken by the second most powerful man on the earth, in their own mother tongue. Picture it. The psychological whiplash is absolute. In their minds, Joseph was the ultimate helpless victim, swallowed by the desert long ago. But the second those 2 Hebrew syllables strike the dead air of the throne room, the victim evaporates. The disguise shatters. The man they threw into the dirt is standing directly above them, dressed in fine linen, holding the undisputed power of execution. The unbending judge of Egypt is the brother they murdered in their hearts. Same blood, same betrayal. The ancient Aramaic translation of the Torah, the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, captures the devastating physical trauma of this exact second. It records that when Joseph spoke those 2 Hebrew words, the brothers' souls actually fled from their bodies in sheer terror. The rabbinic tradition says God had to physically return their breath to them just so they could remain standing on the floor. I offer it as that, one tradition's record. But it brilliantly illustrates the suffocating, paralyzing dread of the guilty suddenly staring into the face of their own inescapable reckoning. The physical language barrier has been shattered, but the spiritual terror has just begun. Watch what the text does. The brother they betrayed is alive. The Egyptian mask is completely gone, but the shock of his true identity is only half of the terror vibrating in this verse. Because immediately after dropping the disguise, Joseph follows his true name with a question that makes absolutely no logical sense. It is a question that defies the entire desperate conversation they just finished having. The true name has been spoken, and the ghost of the pit has become the judge of the palace. But the first thing he demands of them is a piece of information they have already given him multiple times. Why would a man who just listened to Judah deliver a long, agonizing speech about the fragile life of their aging father? Look at his brothers and ask if that same father is still alive? The marble room is completely silent. The echo of those two Hebrew syllables has barely faded. But the terror vibrating in the chamber does not come from the name alone. It comes from the impossible question attached to it. Genesis chapter 45, verse 3, finishes the revelation. I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? Stop right there. Read that question again and watch the paradox unfold. On a purely literal level, this inquiry makes absolutely no sense. For the last 40 verses, Judah has talked about almost nothing else. In the preceding chapter alone, Judah mentions their aging father 14 separate times. He has just delivered a desperate, tear-soaked speech detailing how the old man's life is physically bound up in Benjamin's life. He argued that if the boy does not return to the tents of Hebron, the shock will send their father down to the grave in sorrow. Joseph knows Jacob is breathing. He knows the old man is alive. So why ask? Turn to the ancient rabbinic writings of the Midrash, Genesis, Rabbah. The ancient commentators catch the razor edge of this moment. They recognize that Joseph is not asking for a medical update. He is dropping a devastating moral indictment directly onto their consciences. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. But it exposes the true weight of the confrontation. The rabbis frame this question as a flawless prosecution. Joseph is effectively holding up a mirror to Judah's impassioned speech. Doth my father yet live? You stand here begging for Benjamin's freedom, claiming that the grief of losing this boy will kill our father. Did you care if he lived 22 years ago? Where was this profound, agonizing concern for the old man's fragile heart? When you sold me to Midianites and brought him a coat soaked in goat's blood, sit with that. The ghost of the pit has just pulled the bloody coat of many colors out of the shadows and laid it right on the polished Egyptian floor. Same blood, same betrayal. The brothers are completely trapped by their own words. They are paralyzed. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 17 warns, He that is first in his own cause seemeth just, but his neighbor cometh and searcheth him. Judah sounded incredibly noble defending Benjamin. He sounded like a righteous, self-sacrificing son trying to protect his father back in Canaan. But the true judge has just searched him out. The hypocrisy of their past is laid bare in 5 unanswerable words. The defense attorney has just been unmasked as the murderer. The text says the brothers could not answer him. The silence in the room is no longer the silence of an empty palace. It is the suffocating silence of the damned, standing before the throne of their victim. They have no defense, no interpreter, no alibi. The Egyptian facade is gone, but the brothers are still physically frozen in place. They are looking into the eyes of a man who has every legal and moral right to command their execution. But what exact word does the original Hebrew text use to describe their silence? And why does it reveal a psychological collapse that goes far beyond the fear of the sword? The locked throne room is dead silent. 11 men are staring at the unmasked ruler of Egypt, completely paralyzed. The question about their father has just laid their hypocrisy bare, but it is not just guilt keeping their mouths shut. It is absolute physical horror. Genesis chapter 45, verse 3, captures their exact response in the second half of the verse. It reads, "And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence." Stop right there. Look closely at the word the King James translators rendered as troubled. In modern English, that sounds like mild anxiety or discomfort. It sounds as though the brothers are simply uneasy about the sudden turn of events. But turn the English back into the original Hebrew. The word buried there is bahal. It does not mean a slight disturbance. It means to be struck with sudden, paralyzing terror, to be violently horrified, completely dismayed, and driven to panic. It is the exact same Hebrew root word used in Exodus chapter 15, when Moses sings of the mighty, warlike dukes of Edom being gripped by trembling and melting away at the sheer, terrifying power of God parting the Red Sea. Same root, same terror. Picture it. These are the same battle-hardened Canaanite herdsmen who, just moments ago, according to Jasher, were threatening to draw swords and paint the walls of the Egyptian capital with blood. Now, they are completely hollowed out. They cannot form a single syllable. Their vocal cords are frozen. The interpreter is gone. The Egyptian disguise is gone. The illusion that their past was buried in a dry well in Dothan has just evaporated in front of their eyes. The ancient rabbinic sages understood the staggering psychological weight of this specific Hebrew word. The Jewish midrashic text, Genesis Rabbah, records the visceral reaction of an ancient rabbi named Eleazar when he studied this exact verse. The text says that Rabbi Eleazar would read the words, "They were troubled at his presence," and he would immediately begin to weep. He saw what the brothers were truly facing. He wrote, "Woe unto us on the day of judgment! Woe unto us on the day of rebuke! If the rebuke of Joseph, who was but flesh and blood, so terrified his brothers, how much more the rebuke of the Holy One?" I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but it perfectly captures the spiritual devastation of this room. The brothers are not just standing before a brother they wronged. They are experiencing a miniature day of judgment. The books have been opened. The hidden things have been brought into the blistering light. Every secret lie they told their father, every drop of goat's blood they smeared on the coat of many colors, has just resurrected. It is sitting on a throne, wearing royal linen, staring directly into their eyes. Watch what the text does. They are recoiling. The Hebrew Bahal implies a desperate urge to flee from the horror. They are physically pulling back from the throne, fully expecting the executioner's blade to fall. But Joseph does not call for the guards. Instead, the man who holds the power to erase them from the earth demands that they close the physical distance. He forces them to step toward the very thing that terrifies them. The brothers are frozen in their guilt, waiting for the sentence of death. But when Joseph gives his next physical command, what does he say that completely shatters their expectation of vengeance and radically rewrites the darkest sin of their lives? The men are recoiling. Their bodies are physically pulling back from the throne, trying to escape the blistering heat of their own exposed guilt. They expect the guards to rush the room. They expect the flash of bronze and the final brutal payment for what they did in the dirt of Dothan. Genesis chapter 45, verse 4, records Joseph's response. "And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near. And he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt." Stop right there. Look at the physical command. Come near to me. The natural human instinct when facing the wrath of an absolute judge is to retreat. But the Lord of Egypt is demanding proximity. He forces them to step out of the shadows and walk directly into the light of their own crime. And he does not let them sanitize the history. He looks them in the eyes and names the exact atrocity, "Whom ye sold into Egypt." He makes them look at the wound. But watch what the text does. The very next breath out of his mouth completely shatters the universe they thought they lived in. Verse 5 reads, "Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life." Read that again. This is the most stunning reversal in the ancient record. The brothers are standing there trembling, believing that their hands hold the ultimate power of destruction. They believe their jealousy ruined the family, murdered the favored son, and broke their father's heart forever. But Joseph takes the darkest, most violent sin of their lives and radically rewrites it. One action, two authors. Look at the language underneath the English. The Hebrew text uses two distinct verbs in these parallel sentences, and the shift between them is everything. The first is makar, to sell as merchandise, to trade away a life for silver. The second is shalach, to send as an emissary, to dispatch with divine authority. They thought they were burying a boy in the sand with makar. God was planting a king in the empire with shalach. The ancient Aramaic Targums emphasize this profound shift in agency, reading this moment not as a mere coincidence, but as the sovereign, unalterable decree of heaven set in motion long before the brothers ever lifted a hand. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but the theology of Joseph's statement is absolute. He strips the brothers of their perceived power. They were not the architects of his destruction. They were merely the unwitting couriers of God's preservation. Sit with that. The malice was theirs, but the map belonged to heaven. The terror begins to break in the locked room. The paralyzing dread of an executioner's blade is being replaced by the staggering, incomprehensible weight of unmerited grace. The gap between the throne and the accused is closing. But there is one brother in this room who had no part in the pit. One brother who shares Joseph's mother, who came to this palace entirely innocent of the blood money. The pardon has been spoken. The spiritual terror has been broken. But how does this unmasked king finally shatter the last physical barrier? And what does the final embrace reveal about the true weeping of restoration? Go back now to the room where this film began. The heavy bronze doors pulled shut. The armed Egyptian guards standing in the corridors. The terrified men waiting for the translation of a death sentence from an unrecognizable foreign tyrant. You have read this scene 100 times as a simple story of family reunion. But tonight, you know the violent history bleeding through the polished marble. You know the rabbinic weight of the removed interpreter, the suffocating terror of those two Hebrew words, and the devastating indictment buried in a single question. The Egyptian facade has been entirely dismantled. The unmerited pardon has been spoken, but the final reconciliation requires one last physical act to seal the breached chasm. Genesis chapter 45, verse 14, breaks the final barrier. And he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck, and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. Stop right there. The hands that hold the power to starve or feed the known world are wrapped around the only brother who shares his mother's blood. The weeping here is no longer the violent, terrifying wail that shook the house of Pharaoh just moments before. This is the quiet, heavy weeping of pure restoration. The embrace with Benjamin is a grief for stolen time. The youngest son, who had no part in the pit, who never handled the Midianite silver, who never smeared the coat of many colors with goat's blood, is finally holding his ghost. But watch what the text does. The grace does not stop with the innocent. Verse 15 forces the guilty men to receive the physical touch of their victim. Moreover, he kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. And after that, his brethren talked with him. See the scene. Joseph has to walk up to Judah, the man who priced his life at 20 pieces of silver. He has to walk up to Simeon, the brother ancient tradition names as the one who threw him into the dark. He falls on their necks. The men who violently stripped him of his coat in the dirt of Dothan are now being physically covered by royal Egyptian linen in an embrace they did not earn and can never repay. And then, the text notes, they talked with him, without a middleman, without a lie. The wall is entirely gone. The gracery of this cleared room was never just about a physical disguise. It was about the deliberate removal of mediation between the guilty and their judge. Joseph sent the guards away because grace requires dangerous proximity. He removed the interpreter because true forgiveness cannot be filtered through a second party. He stripped away the Egyptian armor so the men who murdered him in their hearts could feel the very breath of the one who pardoned them. I hold this as one reading, not the final word, but as a bridge between the ancient traditions and the living text. We know the disguise fell. We know the brothers survived the room. But the story is still holding the rest of the mystery. Exactly how the brutal, blood-soaked jealousy of 10 Canaanite herdsmen was simultaneously the precise instrument heaven used to save the world from starvation. The collision of human malice and divine sovereignty remains a paradox locked in that palace chamber, echoing out into the desert. If you made it to the end of this study, comment the word "watched" below. Subscribe to the channel to keep uncovering the buried histories of the biblical text, and send this to one person who loves the Genesis narrative but has never heard. The silence of the removed interpreter. The mask falls, the blood is pardoned, and the victim is the king.